images formed by distortions of Bible illustrations, Orientalist paintings, and the ahistorical imagination of Hollywood. So I'm going to try and help you to understand, from a historical perspective, what was this Jerusalem that is such an important, not only backdrop, but matrix for the sacred events. The first important fact to keep in mind is that there was a sharp conflict between two fundamental realities. The first reality was that the Romans were running the show. Rome had been a rising power throughout the Mediterranean. By the 1st century, before the Common Era, it was moving beyond the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. In 63, before the Common Era, Pompey Magnus went to the land of Israel, ostensibly as an arbiter between two of the Hasmonean princely contenders, and he said, "You're wrong, and you're wrong too. I'm the boss." And Rome swallowed up Israel at that point. At first, Rome ruled through Jewish client kings, the most famous of whom you know was Herod. But after Herod's death, Rome administered the Jewish province through their own bureaucratic appointees. How did you get to be a bureaucratic appointee? First of all, you needed connections. Secondly, you needed a lot of money to spread around. And when you got your appointment, you hoped to recoup your investment by soaking the populace and crushing them as necessary. So being ruled over by Rome was a little bit like being ruled over by the mafia. Keep that in mind. The second reality, opposed to this first one, is that Jerusalem was, as Jerusalem is, the capital of the Jewish world and the focus of the Jewish yearning for independence. This is the inheritance of the Hebrew Bible. Biblical religion regarded the people Israel living in their own land and independent as the norm when achieved, as the ideal to be regained when lost. This was not secular thought in the modern sense. Political aspirations were not removed from the religious. They were seen as the fulfillment of God's promises to the people, made at the time of the establishment of the covenant at Sinai. Some have lost sight of this basic historical truth about the Jewish religion of 2,000 years ago. I believe that there are two reasons for the widespread lack of understanding of what their reality was. First, Christian teaching took the older definition of Messiah as agent of establishing a political kingdom and depoliticized it. King David was a Mashiach. King David was an anointed of the Lord, and his job was to liberate Israel from the Philistine yoke. That's a political kind of Messiah. The great innovation of Christianity was to depoliticize the concept of Messiah. The second reason why we sometimes lose sight of what the historical ground norms were 2,000 years ago is that Jewish teaching, it's true that Jewish teaching kept the hope of restoration of political sovereignty vivid, but in the meantime, Rabbinic Judaism got on with the business of living in the exile. So the understanding of how sharply focused the yearning for political independence was within the religion has been blurred. I should tell you that we won't get a clear sense of how hard it was to live under Rome if we read the New Testament alone. For reasons, various reasons that have to do with who the authors of the Gospels were and what their own needs were that they were trying to solve, the New Testament authors somehow made their peace with Roman rule. The Pontius Pilate of the Passion narrative, for example, emerges as a figure that no Jewish source would recognize. The Roman administrators that we knew, which I think was the Roman administrators of history, would not bend to the wishes of the crowd. They would bring in the troops, and they would wreak some highly visible violence on the ringleaders of the crowd. That's how Romans kept subject peoples in check. Pilate himself was removed for brutality to the Samaritans in the year 36. They gathered at Mount Gerizim, which is in Samaria, which is their Jerusalem, and he didn't like the nationalistic tone of their gathering, and he suppressed that gathering with great violence, excessive even for Roman standards, and so he was removed from office. That's the Pilate of history. So we need to look further to gain a sense of just how much, to quote Shakespeare, the times were out of joint for the Jerusalem resident or visitor in the middle decades of the first century. You can gain that more 3D view if you supplement the biblical texts with Josephus or other contemporary historians' writings. Now, this fundamental unhappiness with the basic situation that Jews under Roman rule felt could and did produce different reactions among different groups. We hear of these groups in the New Testament, in rabbinic literature, and also in Josephus. The Sadducees, you've heard of them. Zadok was one of the early high priests. So Sadducees, it doesn't have any reference to my emotional state. I'm sad, you see, because I don't get to see my grandkids enough, right? You can understand that, right? It doesn't mean that. It's descendant of the high priest Zadok. They tended to be the aristocrats. As aristocrats, they had the most to lose if they did not find a way to accommodate Roman rule. As it says on the Schedule C of your income tax, they had investment at risk. So they tended to be the accommodationists. Yes, as good Jews, they believed that monotheism would triumph over paganism, but they regarded that as a hope to be deferred to the eschaton, the last days. The Pharisees, in most accounts, do not emerge as the hypocritical misanthropes that the conflict stories of the Gospels portray. Although, to be candid, some rabbinic accounts criticize extremists among Pharisees. I'm going to give you a rabbinic statement that there are 7 kinds of Pharisees and 6 of them are bad. It's a great text. I love it because it so clearly shows what's wrong with the hyper-religious zealots that I see amongst my people today. Our rabbis have taught, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, there are 7 types of Pharisees. The ostentatious Pharisee, Jesus knew about that. That's the guy with big phylacteries, remember that? The Pharisee who knocks his feet together and walks with exaggerated humility. Look at me, how humble I am. Right? The third type of Pharisee knocks his face against the wall rather than gaze at a woman. Then again, there's the Pharisee who feigns religious piety while constantly exclaiming, "What is my duty that I may perform it?" And are the journalists watching? Are you taking notes? Now, here's the good one. There are also Pharisees who act out of love. But others act out of fear, i.e., who serve God because of ulterior motives, or conversely, because they fear retribution. Lastly, there is the Pharisee who wraps himself in his cloak, feigning humility. I'll tell you a great Jewish joke about that. It's the Saturday night before the New Year, and it's a time of repentance. And the rabbi, overcome with the penitential mood, jumps up and says, "Oh God, I am nothing and less than nothing." And then the cantor does the same. "I am nothing and less than nothing," because cantors have good voices. And then the sexton, right? The sexton gets up and says, "God, I'm nothing and less than nothing." And the cantor turns to the rabbi and says, "Look who thinks he's nothing and less than nothing." So this notion that some people feign humility, it's not confined to Pharisees. It's a universal problem given the human heart. While this rabbinic account is critical of religiosity for show in its various guises, it doesn't condemn the entire sect. The rabbis regarded the Pharisees who act out of love as worthy of emulation, and taught that such service is the goal to which Jews should aspire. The portrayal of the Pharisees in Josephus highlights that the populace at large respected them for their piety. This accords with the understanding that some were indeed to be criticized, but by no means all. The populace as a whole accepted the counsel attributed to Jesus to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's as a bitter necessity. And on that subject, I'm going to ask John to begin showing around a very precious item. So that's why it's wrapped in plastic and can't let you touch it, but you can look at it. These are 2 half-shekel coins that are approximately 1950 or 2,000 years old. 1 half-shekel is from the city-state of Tyre, and its silver coin was reputed to be the least debased, the purest throughout the whole region. So that's the half-shekel that Jesus would have recognized. The second one is the half-shekel minted by Jewish revolutionaries. They weren't happy that there's an image of a pagan god on the first one, even though it was the silver standard of the region. So when they minted coins, there were no pagan images. There's a chalice for presentation to the temple, and there's the pomegranate, but no idolatrous images. So these are the actual coins. Now, there were some in Jerusalem, as we were walking on our walking tour, who kept the yearning for political freedom as an immediate and urgent goal. Josephus called these people, quote, the adherents of the 4th philosophy, beyond the 3 of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. The Essenes I always think of a little bit like hippies. You know, they felt that the big city is a sinful place. They wanted to go to the Dead Sea where it's really hard to get into trouble. The 4th philosophy were the people whom any Roman administrator would regard as a threat to be suppressed because they wanted their freedom now. They would have flown "Don't tread on me" flags if they'd been living amongst us today. How would the Roman administrator suppress such a threat? Well, let's say by crucifying anyone they might regard as someone who would lead people into rebellion. Whatever the titulus on the cross meant to the Gentile authors of the Gospels, a half century or 2/3 of a century after the actual events, I can tell you what that titulus meant to Pontius Pilate. For him to inscribe King of the Jews as the titulus on the cross meant this: no rebellion against me will succeed. That's the message he was trying to broadcast. With this baseline of tension, a sufficiently offensive provocation could spark an insurrection. This very nearly happened in Jerusalem a few years only after the Passion, during the reign of Gaius, better known as Caligula, in the year 40. I'm going to quote from the historical annals. The Emperor Caligula announced that a statue of himself, portrayed as the Roman god Jupiter, would be placed in the temple at Jerusalem. The announcement was the culmination of a series of proclamations and role-playing, whereby Caligula presented himself as a divine or semi-divine being. It was not just impersonation. Caligula intended that he really was to be identified as the demigod that was being represented, and further, that he was the embodiment of all the demigods. The charade or the megalomania went further when he progressed beyond demigods to the gods themselves. He attired himself in the caduceus, the sandals, and the tunic of Mercury, the garlands, bow, and arrows of Apollo, and then the breastplate, sword, and helmet of Mars. Now, revolt did not break out in the year 40-41 because Caligula was assassinated. And his successor, Claudius, a far more prudent ruler, which you might remember if you saw the Robert Graves I, Claudius special on PBS years ago, if you remember that. Claudius was a far more prudent ruler. He sent his fastest galley, I'm thinking it was a trireme, sent it to Israel with an order to countermand the provocative move of Caligula. Claudius's galley overtook Caligula's, and peace was maintained. But in 66, just a generation afterwards, a riot between Jews and Greco-Romans in Caesarea, which was itself a protest against the callous indifference of the procurator Florus to the crushing conditions imposed on the Jews, that riot had a tragic aftermath. Again, I'll quote from the history. Gessius Florus, in a rage of scorned hubris, plundered the holy temple to fund the cult of Caesar, and erected statues of the Emperor Nero and himself with the money he took. This enraged the Jewish people. The temple was not only the center of religious and social life for the Jewish people, but it was a sign of God's presence in the holy city. When Florus raided the temple and ordered the residents nearby to follow his form of polytheism around it, it was the biggest insult to the Jewish religion. The Jewish people rebelled. So that's the danger, and that's how it could and did result in a fire of devastation. But let's now imagine that we're in the 30s, not in the 40s or 60s of the first century, the very time of the fateful entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. We will find a mid-sized city whose population was in the tens of thousands, not a small town. How do we know this? Josephus tells us that in the year 70, when Jerusalem was besieged, it had a population of 100,000. And I think we may assume that when the Romans devastated the Galilee in the 3 years leading up to that siege, a number of refugees, maybe a large number of refugees, streamed into Jerusalem to take safety behind its walls. So somewhere in the tens of thousands in the 30s. This would have functioned as many a city in Roman times and before and after, a place of commerce and manufacture. Farmers would have brought their wares to market. The buying and selling would typically be done in stalls or small structures known as tabernacula, that's where the word tabernacle comes from, lining the main streets. Where precisely would we have gone to do our shopping in Jerusalem in the 30s? The Cardo Maximus in the old city of Jerusalem today is an archaeological restoration of the city of Jerusalem, but from the 2nd century, not the 1st century. The Romans had destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70. And the Emperor Hadrian, in the 130s, after putting down another revolt, ordered that Jerusalem be rebuilt as a pagan-only city. He called it Aeola Capitalina. The builders followed standard Roman urban planning, and they put the main business street on the north-south axis of the city. You see this all over the Roman Empire. There may have been a commercial street there in the 1st century because some of the structures found by archaeologists are older still, from Hasmonean times. But we know better about another commercial hub from the 1st century, the so-called Cheesemakers Street. Now, before we go off to Williamsburg to the cheese shop, hold off and think, but we're going to get back to this Cheesemakers Street in a minute. It lay underneath what is now the Western Wall Plaza. Some of you might have visited the Western Wall, and you were standing some meters above that street. It ran from north to south, from north at the current-day Damascus Gate, which is the northern gate of the old city walls, going down to what's called the Pool of Siloam, which is beyond the end of the current city walls in what used to be called the City of David. The location is geographically significant. It is in the valley between the 2 hills that make up Jerusalem, Mount Moriah on the east, where the Temple Mount was, and the higher Mount Zion on the west, which was called the Upper City. Our tour guide again is Josephus, and he wrote, "The city was built upon 2 hills which are opposite to one another and have a valley to divide them, at which valley the corresponding rows of houses on both hills end. Of these hills, that which contains the upper city is much higher and its length more direct. Now the, quote, Valley of the Cheesemakers, as it was called, and what that which we told you before distinguished the hill of the upper city from that of the lower, extended as far as Siloam," in other words, this pool. But the name Cheesemakers is probably a mistake. No other contemporary text corroborated the idea that the street, the main drag, right, the Virginia Beach Boulevard of Jerusalem, there's no other text that corroborates that it was involved in food production. The Israeli archaeologist Don Bahat proposes a plausible substitute. He thinks the original name was Valley of the Silversmiths, which very well could have been the activity on that street. In Hebrew, this would have been Emek HaTzorfim, Tzorfim. Now the ts, like pizza, the ts does not have a phoneme in the Greek alphabet. There's no one letter in Greek for ts. Just like there's no one letter in English for ts, right? How would you spell ts, right? You use ZZ like pizza or TS or something like that, or my last name Panitz, right? You only need one letter in Hebrew for the last letter of my name. Tz. So transliterated into Greek, the word Sorfim would become Turopim, Turopim, because the ts is lost. Turopim doesn't mean anything in Greek. So what the archaeologist thinks is that a later copyist of Josephus altered the meaningless word Turopim to Turopoion, which means cheesemakers. This is a far more picturesque name for the Greek audiences, and it has stuck to the present day. So the street, not really known as the Street of the Cheesemakers, was the main drag of commercial 1st century Jerusalem. Now, our experience walking through Jerusalem in the 30s would change dramatically if we went at one of the 3 times during the year of the pilgrimage holidays: Passover, Pesach, Shavuot, Pentecost, and Sukkot, Tabernacles. Jews from across Israel and beyond made special efforts to go to Jerusalem at that time and offer sacrifices in the Holy Temple. That temple stood on the site of Solomon's original temple, built a millennium before. Solomon's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 before the Common Era, as is chronicled in the book of 2 Kings. Half a century after that catastrophe, the Persian monarch Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews exiled to Babylon to go back to Judah. Some did, under the leadership of one of the descendants of King David named Zerubbabel, and they rebuilt the temple. It took them 20 years, but in the year 516, the second temple was dedicated. 70-year lapse between the destruction of the first temple and the dedication of the second temple. It was apparently an unprepossessing building. It was built on a shoestring, basically. Herod, the master builder and Roman client king in late 1st century BCE Israel, rebuilt Zerubbabel's temple in grandiose style. The Herodian structure was one of the architectural wonders of its day. To accommodate it, Herod had the entire top of Mount Moriah leveled, producing a plaza on which the temple could stand. That plaza endures. And the western wall, the holiest site in the world in Jerusalem, is its retaining wall. Imagine that. The Romans are destroying the temple, but they're not going to destroy the retaining wall. That'll just produce an avalanche, not help them at all. So that's why the western wall of the temple endures, and only that wall. It's not the wall of the temple itself, it's the retaining wall of the plaza. Think of terrace gardening, you'll understand this. On the plaza itself, where the temple had stood until the Romans destroyed it, Byzantine Christians erected a church in the 4th century. Muslims razed that church and erected their iconic Mosque of Omar over it, all over the footprint of Zerubbabel's temple, which itself is on the footprint of Solomon's temple. Herod's temple not only commanded the view, but also beckoned the Jewish heart. And that's what I spoke about in the sermon earlier. The religious commandment to present oneself before the Lord on those 3 times of the year was considered a principal religious duty. The pilgrims would have started their ascent to the temple at the Siloam pool. It's like a big baptism in that sense. They would have immersed themselves in the pool so that they would be in a state of ritual purity when entering the temple precinct. They would then walk up the road, right, the not cheesemakers road, to a grand stairway, and ascend the stairway to the temple plaza. You can see images of that, artist renderings in what I gave you. Now, you probably know about the money changers in the temple. The historical reality behind those stories is this. The temple was a pilgrimage destination. People were there to offer animal sacrifices or wine libations or grain. What's easier? To bring bluebell all the way from Cappadocia, or to come to Jerusalem, spend some money, buy a cow right there? So there was a lot of commerce going on because of the pilgrimage, because of what pilgrimage entailed. And as, thank you, John, as you've just seen, there was the half shekel that people were. Now, what do you do if you have bronze perutot? You don't have a half shekel. So the money changers would change your money for the needed half shekel. And of course, they would take a commission. That's what money changers do. By the way, if you go to Israel, the worst ones are the hotel clerks. So there are money changers on the street, and they always give you better rates than the hotels. So you should know. I want to defend the good name of money changers. The money changers who don't say they're money changers are actually worse than the money changers who do say they're money changers. You know, the devil you know and the devil you don't know, right? So that's what was happening with these money changers. The population of Jerusalem swelled considerably during these festivals. Where did they stay? Was there a Tom Baudet in Jerusalem? I'll leave the light on for you. Well, certainly there were homes, and some of them were probably opened as a gesture of kindness, and some of them might have been opened as hostels. So let me just take a little digression and talk to you about giving birth in the manger. It's not Lent, it's more Advent, but I want you to understand this. If you look at the image of the cutout of a typical house, the typical Canaanite four-room house, it's like the Cape Cod of ancient Israel. The Cape Cod of ancient Israel has 3 rooms for human habitation and a 4th room as a stable, all under the same roof. And it's a flat roof. There's not much rain or snow there. There's no snow. So the roof is flat because you don't need a pitch for snow to come down off of. And they could use the roof for drying flax or other industrial activities. So when there's no room at the inn, such that she gives birth in the manger, it doesn't mean that she goes half a mile down the road. It means that they put her into the 4th room of the 4-room house. If ever you get to Philadelphia, I warmly recommend a visit to the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. They did a lot of Middle Eastern archaeological expeditions in the 19-teens and 20s. They have a 4-room house there. So if you get to Philly, you'll see it, and you'll know exactly what we're talking about, and the infancy narrative will come clear at that point. So there was also another place where pilgrims could stay. In 1913, a very important archaeological find in the city of David, which is the oldest part of Jerusalem. I'm going to read the inscription. It's in Greek. I'll read the translation. Theodotus, son of Vetinus, Kohen and leader of the synagogue, son of a leader of the synagogue, grandson of a leader of the synagogue. Apparently they had FFJ back then, First Families of Jerusalem. Built the synagogue for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments, and also a guest chamber and the upper rooms. Upper rooms. That should remind you of New Testament talks, right? New Testament texts. And the ritual pools of water for accommodating those needed them from abroad. You may know that there's a Yiddish word for synagogue. We call it a shul. In the 1940s, there was a Jewish community center movement. They thought that if you get them in for the sports program, maybe they'll stay for the worship. So we used to call that generation of architecture the shul with the pool. But the shul with the pool in first century Jerusalem wasn't because Jews were basically secular and we needed to trick them into coming to worship. No, it's because the pilgrims would go on to the temple. They needed to bathe themselves first. They needed to have a kind of a baptismal experience. So the synagogue had a pool. I understand that we had a lot of water problems here. We could have done that. We could have turned it into a big baptistry down below. Jerusalem then was a place of longing and belonging in the first century. This pattern has endured. Jews were banished from Jerusalem after the Romans crushed the Jewish revolts, but Jews found their way back. Jews were again slaughtered and new Jewish settlers prohibited by the Crusaders in 1099. But Jews again found their way back after the fall of the Crusader kingdom in 1187. The Jordanians conquered the old city of Jerusalem in 1948, but Israelis reunited the old city with the city's modern suburbs in 1967. Since then, Jewish Jerusalem has been restored. The temple does not stand, but the pull of Jerusalem continues to make itself felt in contemporary Jewish consciousness. I'll conclude with the words of Naomi Shemer, the Israeli songwriter, who lamented the loss of Jerusalem in a very famous song written just before the Six-Day War, Jerusalem of Gold. And then, after the Six-Day War, she added one last stanza to express the joy at its reunification. As clear as wine, the wind is flying among the dreamy pines, as evening light is slowly dying, and a lonely bell still chimes. In the trance of pine and stone, captive as in a thrall, the city that mourning dwells alone, and in her heart a wall. Jerusalem all of gold, Jerusalem bronze and light, within my heart I shall treasure your song and sight. Alas, the dry wells and fountains, forgotten market day, the sound of horn from Temple's mountain no longer calls to pray. The rocky caves at night are haunted by sounds of long ago, when we were going to the Jordan by way of Jericho. Yerushalayim all of gold, Yerushalayim bronze and light, within my heart I shall treasure your song and sight. But when I come to count your praises and sing hallelujah to you, with pretty rhymes I dare not crown you. As other poets do, upon my lips is always burning your name so dear, so old. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, of bronze and light and gold. Yerushalayim all of gold, Yerushalayim bronze and light, within my heart I shall treasure your song and sight. And then after the Six-Day War, Naomi Shemer added the following stanza. Back to the wells and to the fountains within the ancient walls, the sound of horn from Temple's mountain again so loudly calls. From rocky caves this very morning 1,000 suns will glow, and we shall go down to the Jordan by way of Jericho. And I'll sing it for you in Hebrew. Yerushalayim shel zahav, v'shel nechoshet v'shel or, halo lechol shirayich ani chinor. Yerushalayim shel zahav, v'shel nechoshet v'shel or, halo lechol shirayich ani chinor. Jerusalem. Thank you so much for being here and for your attention and your participation. Thank you.